All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipovich Show is my good buddy Lee Fang. Lee is a reporter for The Nation magazine, which you can find at thenation.com. He is the author of the book The Machine, A Field Guide to the Resurgent Right, which you can find at themachinebook.com. You can also, of course, follow him on Twitter at LHFang. Lee, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Hey, Matt, thanks for having me.
All right, so Lee, you recently wrote a really, really interesting piece at The Nation called The Scholars Who Shill for Wall Street. And it's a really, really interesting angle on supposed academics who testify against all types of regulation. Why don't you tell us all about it?
Well, Matt, there's, in Washington, sponsored research happens all the time. If you're a lobbying group, you always want to bring in academics or scholars who can provide some kind of cachet to your arguments. But Dodd-Frank, the big Wall Street reform bill that President Obama signed into law in 2010, creates unique incentives for this type of academic astroturfing, if you will. So the law has 400 regulations, and they're all kicked to the various agencies, the SEC, the CFTC, et cetera, to promulgate these rules. Well, something interesting happened 1 year after Obama signed this into law. There was a D.C. Circuit decision, and this is a very conservative appellate court. And what the court said was that, these Dodd-Frank regulations, it's not enough for the regulators to come up with their own studies and come up with their own cost-benefit analysis to justify these rules. Regulators have to take into account all the different comments and letters submitted to them as they're coming up with these regulations. So that has created a unique incentive for Wall Street banks, financial institutions, when they're fighting these other regulations. And remember, half of Dodd-Frank still hasn't been written, still hasn't been implemented. To just go out and hire a Yale professor or a Stanford professor or a University of Maryland professor, what have you, and flood the zone with dozens and dozens of studies so that, hopefully, in their point of view, the regulation bends towards their favor, has a loophole that they're looking for, or cancels out a provision they don't like. And if the regulation comes out in a way that they don't like, they can go to court, cite this D.C. Circuit decision, and say, hey, look, the regulators didn't take into account this professor's study. Hey, federal court, you should knock this down. And that's been a very successful strategy. So we have a huge problem of sponsored academics really tearing down financial reform.
Unbelievable. Let's talk about one of them that you talk about and highlight in your article, and that is Professor Todd Zywicki. Tell us, who is Todd Zywicki, and what exactly what's the type of stuff that he's actually brought forth to this matter?
Well, Mr. Zywicki is a professor at George Mason Law School, and he's really been vying to be the toughest critic of the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He kind of mocks Elizabeth Warren, the architect of the Bureau. He constantly says that, if you regulate payday lenders, if you regulate overdraft fees, if you regulate installment loans, all of these different practices that have been shown to be very predatory, to have high interest rates or hidden fees that really hurt the working poor in America. He's the biggest opponent. He'll write a study. You'll see him on the news. He writes op-eds in all the major newspapers. And, of course, in the regulatory process I was referencing earlier, you see his name constantly. He's cited by all the big lobbyists. He presents his own studies. He's a pretty big player. What Mr. Zywicki doesn't reveal, when he does all of this advocacy, he only identifies himself as an academic. But what he doesn't reveal is that he is also a top executive at a consulting firm that helps Wall Street firms find the right scholar to push back on regulations like on the CFPB. And he's got a number of other conflicts, one of which is the firm Morgan Drexen. It's actually debt relief company that was sued by the CFPB earlier this year for deceiving consumers and charging illegal upfront fees. It's one of those companies that has one of those ads that has ads on like the radio or on late night television that says, "Oh, you can get rid of your debts, overnight. Just give us a call and pay us this fee."
Right.
But they don't actually do anything. They just they get people to sign up and pay them a lot of money. And what's been alleged is essentially they get swindled. Nothing happens. So this firm is actually paying Zwicky $500 an hour at the moment to help with their fight with regulators. And so these are potential conflicts of interest that Zwicky has never disclosed, whether he's speaking in the media or speaking to regulators. But what's tremendous about this situation is that he's not unique. There are many other professors from state colleges, from Ivy Leagues that act essentially the same.